So let's say you have an idea that could be a next billion-dollar company, and you have the necessary data and all the business logic encapsulated, but you're wondering, how do you distribute this to other enterprises or third-party developers who can leverage all this existing business logic and data and build their application on top of it? So the answer clearly is that you need an API. But how do you create an API, and how do you monetize an API, and how do you distribute an API? So in this video, we are going to look at a few of the components that can help you see what components are involved and where are some of the complexities involved in making APIs a product business. So if we zoom out a little bit, there are two parts to selling API or making API as a product. The first is the API producing side. How do you create an API? And the second is the API consuming side. How people can consume your APIs. So before we jump into the consuming side, let's see what things we need to do in order to create and distribute APIs. So going back into this diagram on the producing side, we'll start from the right side. So you have a data, you have a business logic. And for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that you have your data and business logic well tested. So in order to generate APIs on top of it, you need series of steps to be performed. So first thing you need to do is you need to create APIs, and the API creation process starts with the design process. What parts of your data or what part of your business can be exposed to other customers so that they can leverage your business logic? So this is where the design piece becomes extremely important. So there are tools that you can leverage to create API. Now you also need to decide what kind of API you need to build. Are you creating a GraphQL API? Or you're designing a set of RESTful APIs. For the sake of this discussion, we are going to focus on the RESTful APIs. And maybe in a future video, we can explore how you can develop and design the GraphQL APIs. So in order to design the RESTful APIs, you need to design a specification based on Open API. And there are a set of tools that you can leverage to design your APIs. Now, keep in mind that there is some code involved to design this API. This is not a visual design. This is a structure, a spec that you need to design your APIs. But once you have the design in place, you can use the code generators to create the stubs that your backend and your frontend systems can use. Now, once your design is ready, the next phase is development, which means you have a specification, and now you need to map the request and the response to ensure that you're calling the right business logic and doing the right set of things. This is where the API development comes in. But how do you know that your API are working correctly? This is where the testing of APIs become extremely important. Now, keep in mind that at this point in time, we are talking only about the API testing. This does not negate the need of testing your data and your business logic. They're extremely important and are faster to run. But at the level of the APIs, you also need to write your test to ensure that the API contract is maintained. And if the API contract is not maintained, you are sending or throwing the right set of errors. Now, assuming that you have done all the three steps, the next thing is to release your API. At this point in time, you need to make a decision on which provider you're picking to release your APIs. You can run them directly through your data center, or the choice could be you can use one of the existing infrastructure as a service provider, either AWS, Google Cloud Platform, or Azure. Once your APIs are released, you need to ensure that your APIs are working correctly. They are scaling up and down as needed. They are generating enough data to be able to see if the APIs are taking more time or less time, if they're failing. And for that, there are two pieces of information or two pieces of technology you need to bake in. First is the API monitoring on how your APIs are working, and then logging each and every request. This is important so that you can see what came in and what went out. This is also important soon when we will talk about the API consuming side. Now, once your API is released, it's always the case that you're going to evolve them, which means now your consumers are using it and they're asking for more set of APIs, or you found a bug in your system and you need to fix it and release a newer set of APIs. This is where the loop of new versions come in. So when the new version needs to be released, it needs to follow the same cycle of design, development, testing, and release cycle. Once your APIs are deployed, now they are ready to be consumed, but you still need to make few decisions. For example, how are your API consumers going to call your APIs? Is it publicly available to everybody, or you need to deploy some sort of security? A common practice when selling API as a product is to ensure that every API caller has been handed over an API key so that every request made to the API is associated with the API caller. This can help you in many ways. For example, you can see how your API consumers are calling APIs. If they have certain problems, they can hand you over their API key and ask about it. So debugging becomes easier. And it also helps with collecting the usage and charging the right set of money based on their usage. When I talk about collecting money, the second aspect that you have to think about is how do you monetize your APIs? Now, there could be different set of strategies that you can deploy. You can have a usage-based pricing, so pay-per-use pricing, or you can design plans wherein you have a quota for a specific plan and your API caller will make calls within that specific quota. You also need to decide on who is your billing provider. A very common use case in the industry is to leverage Stripe because it allows you to deploy those pricing strategies. Now, as you can see that the logging becomes important here because as you log, you can aggregate and send information to Stripe because that's how Stripe will know for a given API consumer how much of which API call they have made and invoice them accordingly. Now, considering your API producing side is ready, there is one more piece during the release that we haven't talked about is how do your API consumers know what APIs to hit? And that's where the API documentation becomes really important, which is a perfect segue to move into the API consuming side. Now, considering that you have a search API and you want your consumers to search the specific data that you have, your consumers need a set of tools in order to be able to make that API call. First of all, they need to create and manage their API key. Then, if you are monetizing your API, you need to have a way so that your API consumers can select the API plan. They should also be able to view their usage and the logs for each and every API call they have made. Now, all of these four boxes perfectly align in a consumer developer portal, which is self-serve. So if your API consumers find out that you have an interesting data and they want to leverage, they can go to a website, which is your developer portal, sign up there, create the API key, select a plan, and start using that API key to make the calls and see their usage and how they are built. And the second part again is how do they know which API call to make? What HTTP methods are allowed? What is the request shape? What is the response shape? What do these errors mean? So these 4 parts or 5 parts in the system is the API consuming side. So to summarize, there are 2 parts of selling API as a product business, the producing side of the APIs and the consuming side. And if you really want to be successful in this business, you need to think of both sides as equally important. Because you may end up spending a lot of your time and energy in the producing side, but if there is no way for your consumers to discover your APIs, to be able to create the API keys and see the logs, your product may not be successful. So keep those in mind. And in the future videos, we are going to explore each and every part of this box and we'll start peeling the onions. And hopefully we'll also see some of the code as we go down this chain. Thank you very much.